Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
To get us started, can you tell me a little bit about your own early experiences? So you grew up in the Netherlands and earned your undergraduate and master's degrees in psychology, and then you came to the United States and earned a PhD in biological anthropology at UCLA, and now you're in work in the Netherlands. So I'm interested in what inspired the educational path, and also what it was like to live and study and work in different countries.
Thank you. Well, so I actually had a somewhat unusual, in a positive way, childhood because when I was about 9 years of age, my father became the general director of Artis Amsterdam Zoo, which is the second oldest zoo in Europe. And with that position came a house where the general director needed to live. And so when I was 9, we moved into this house, in a zoo to Amsterdam. Before this, we lived in a much smaller village. And it was fascinating to, actually live around the animals. We could see and hear the animals, and, in the mornings and in the evenings, I'd go into the zoo. And my dad has actually a background in biology and sort of a strong interest in animal behavior. And so we would often walk through the zoo together, and he would ask me questions about, the physical characteristics of the animals, like the peacock's feathers, or also about their behavior, like why is the male or the female showing this behavior. And so I think that sort of maybe, laid some of the groundwork, sowed some of the seeds, although it's very hard to know in retrospect, for my interest in adaptation. And of course, adaptation, happens on different timescales. So it happens across generations as animals pass on to their offspring certain characteristics that make them well adapted to their environment. But also it happens during the lifetime when we have experiences and we use those experiences to adapt to the environment. And so yeah, I basically grew up in a zoo. That's what my early childhood was like, and it was very nice.
And then what inspired the change from living in and working in the Netherlands to come to the United States?
Yeah, so as a child, I think I was always interested in what drives people, what motivates people, and also sometimes, there's a discrepancy between what people say they want or say that they're going to do and what they actually want and actually do. And I found that very interesting. And so I think I was always kind of interested in social science, but I wasn't sure, where in social science my interest lied the most. And so I first went actually to the UK to study for 1 year. And that was a sort of a general social science program where you got a little bit of everything. And I thought it was really fun and interesting. And then at some point I read the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and that sort of helped me bring together different perspectives on social science in a way that really got me excited. So then I thought, okay, I want to study evolution and human behavior, essentially. And so in the Netherlands, where I was happy, I had my friends, my family, I tried to study this topic as much as possible, but there weren't really specialized programs in this field. So what I did is I studied psychology, but I took some courses in biology, and then I just read, a ton of, papers and books that were in that area that came mostly from the United States and from some other countries, like from England. And then when I really decided I wanted to pursue this topic, I basically started to look for programs that were specialized, in evolution and human behavior. And at UCLA, there is a wonderful program there. And so, I applied, got in, and it was like, a kid in a candy store, where suddenly I was among all these other people that were just as interested in these things, who knew more about it than I did. And it was just like soaking up the information and so inspiring. And I only have fond memories of that experience, although of course there are also challenges to moving away far from home and so on. So yeah, that's why I moved to the United States, and then my goal always was to eventually, hopefully, move back to the Netherlands, because I do have strong ties here with family and friends, and so I feel extraordinarily lucky that I in the end also had the opportunity to work here again.
Your life as a researcher and a scientist now, is it what you had always dreamed of and expected, or are there some differences, maybe some unexpected joys, but maybe also some challenges that you weren't aware of?
So the good slash best thing, I think, is that, you know, this spark, this inspiration that really got me going in this area, it's remained with me throughout. I feel so lucky that it really makes things easier when you wake up in the morning and you really feel like reading this thing or thinking about this thing or trying to work together with somebody to solve this problem. And so the continual kind of inspiration is what I kind of hoped for and what I got so far. And I also realized that, you know, sometimes those things can come and go, and that might well happen to me in the future. But so far, that's been really wonderful. One thing that's challenging, I think, about being in academia, and it might be different for different people, but I do hear it around me too, not just in the Netherlands, but also, you know, worldwide, is that it's the kind of job where there isn't really a externally imposed cap on, you know, on what you can do. So in some sense, like, sky is the limit, and that's in a way liberating and exciting, but it's also difficult because it means you have to set your own boundaries.
Your research studies how people develop in adverse conditions. Can you tell me a little bit more about what inspired this line of research, and why you pursue it?
Yeah, sure. I myself have grown up in a family that in many ways is very privileged, with a lot of love and stability and you know, enough resources. And so I come from a, you know, in many ways a beneficial background, but I had close friends who came from tougher backgrounds during my sort of adolescence. And you know, I noticed how they struggled in school or didn't care about school, and, you know, dropped out of school. And at the same time, I noticed that, you know, they had, you know, they had a huge amount, you know, of skill in complex, you know, situations that sometimes just baffled me, how quick they were on their feet and how they sort of managed really complicated social situations, sometimes situations that involved, you know, threat and different people knowing different things and like knowing how to. So it was clear to me that they had very, you know, sophisticated and sort of, you know, analytical social, you know, cognition, and could problem solve very quickly. And they were very smart, really smart. But, you know, it was not the kind of smarts that, you know, that became so manifest in school. And so when later, you know, I was reading research in developmental psychology, I often felt that the prevailing perspectives, you know, focused on either, you know, which skills these youth were lacking, essentially, like the reasons why they weren't succeeding in sort of school and in other societal benchmarks that people, you know, consider sort of positive development. But I also felt that the benchmarks they were compared with were, you know, were not the benchmarks that they themselves would be working with in their lives. And so I basically felt that the prevailing perspectives were not really doing enough justice to the rationality of some of the choices they made, and the sort of social and cognitive skills that they use to navigate the challenging environments that they have. And so I like to make a distinction between sort of reasonable or rational responses, which could be things like, you know, if your future is very uncertain, then maybe it's, you know, reasonable to invest in things that could lead to rewards in the here and now, you know, quick rewards, instead of investing in an educational program, which then potentially, you know, with follow-up education after 10 years could result in a stable job. And hidden talents, or, you know, skills and abilities that have adapted to adversity, to the kinds of challenges that people who are exposed to higher levels of adversity face, that they, you know, skills that they use to solve the problems that they have, but which are not optimally measured and leveraged in normative settings like schools and jobs typically. And so I'm particularly interested in those kind of rational or reasonable responses, and those hidden talents, and trying to understand how people in those contexts use these these responses and these skills to make the best of the difficult, hand they've been dealt. And I think it's hard for people sometimes to understand that hand if they themselves come from a more privileged background. And so I really think it requires the kinds of obstacles and uncertainties and limitations and or concerns or that have a huge impact on how those people navigate the choices that they make and the skills that they need to develop. It's really hard to see those if you yourself rarely, if ever, experience those. Actually, this is also what I think of as definitely not the only, but just one argument for diversity in science. I think understanding the obstacles, the constraints, and the rationality and the skills that people use to navigate challenges in their environment requires, people who have had different experiences, because it's easier, for people who come from that background, perhaps, to understand that context and understand those responses. And some people kind of leap from seeing lower performance to inferring that there are neural or cognitive deficits in the participant. And in some cases that could explain some of the results, but in other cases, there are also explanations that might be more external to the participant, related to, for example, the kinds of learning opportunities they did and did not have during their lifetime. And so we discuss all of those, but we try to be sensitive in considering various explanations and using terms that our participants hopefully would be comfortable with. What's nice, actually, is that I recently started doing something called, it's called co-creation, is a term that some people use, and it's where you actually try to involve participants in the design of your studies. And that, so for example, you could ask people who themselves come from these more adverse backgrounds about the kinds of skills that they think, we ought to look for, and, how we ought to measure them. Now, of course, we may or may not ask these things as directly as I articulate them now, but there are various ways of sort of eliciting information about those skills and about ways in which to measure them, where you receive input from the populations that you're interested in studying. It's not implying that people necessarily know exactly which skills they have. That's true for all of us. We may or may not accurately estimate our own skills. We may or may not know how we can measure our skills best, but it's valuable input. And it breaks down the barrier a little bit of the scientists in their ivory tower designing this thing and like putting it out there in this community center, but rather sitting at the table with the youth and the social workers and trying to bridge the information flow.
I know that you're dedicated to open science. Can you tell me about what exactly that means in a practical sense, and also why that's important to you?
Okay. So to me, the aspect of open science that I think, I'm most sort of committed to is transparency. So to me, if you ask me to summarize, what I value the most in open science, it's transparency. And that means that people are transparent about, basically at different stages of the research process, what they were thinking and doing, so that other people can precisely reconstruct their actions. And open science also then, to me, involves reproducibility. So being transparent about those steps allows other people to exactly replicate those steps. Making the data and the materials available enables people to actually, redo the analysis using your own data set, or to use the same materials to rerun the study, on a similar or different sample. But it's sort of putting everything out there in the open for others to evaluate. And open science actually, according to many people, also involves other pillars or components. So things like, diversity and inclusion and open access publishing, so that everybody in the world can read science. And I also hugely care about those things. But for me, it started out with an interest in transparency, essentially. How do I make my research more transparent? What can I do?
Can you talk about a particular challenge that you've experienced and how you were able to navigate that?
Mm-hmm. It's often quite challenging for couples to find academic positions, in the same location. And so for us, it's been the case that for 3 or 4 years, we were separate, physically separate, for 6, 7 months, sometimes 8 months in a row. Now that's really hard, that's really challenging. And I think also I'm sure there are some scientific, couples who just cannot, where one, for instance, might give up on doing science because they just, they prioritize being with their partner, but it means that they cannot work in science, or they might have a position in science that's much less desirable than a position that they could have gotten if they, if they would have followed sort of an individual path. It has implications for when and whether or not you may be able to have, children, and so it really is a hard thing. And so that's been a real challenge for us. We kind of made it through, and well, we did make it through, but we still are in a somewhat challenging situation because we live in the Netherlands, but my wife is working in Germany, which is a substantial commute. Fortunately, she has some flexibility in how often she can be there, and a lot of things she can do online. But that remains a challenge, and her position there is temporary, and our hope is that we can stay here, and we would love, we love where we live, and I'm very happy with my job. But if for my wife there wouldn't be anything here and there would be something for her somewhere else, it's something we would have to consider, of course. And so then that kind of instability is challenging. Sometimes in science it's called the two-body problem. But I also know people who don't like that label, and I can sympathize with them. They say it's a two-body opportunity, because if you do offer, the scientific couple there, a position, they are, they're very likely to, it's good for their personal lives, and it's less likely that they will go elsewhere because it's challenging to find that kind of position somewhere else.
The students who are watching this video, what words of inspiration or advice might you have for them?
To try to follow your heart. I will also say that that's a message that is easier, I think, to say for people who are in more privileged circumstances than for people in less privileged circumstances, because if you just need your income right now to be able to, pay the rent, you don't always have the luxury of sort of pursuing what you're most interested in. You may just need to work to get the money now. So I realize this is a message that is not necessarily for always possible for everyone, but within the constraints that everybody faces, and some people face more and others face fewer constraints, trying to feel what makes your heart thump when you're reading, listening, trying to find common denominators in those things. But I think sort of everybody occasionally feels their heart thump about something that they read or learn, or so that's true for everybody who's listening now, I'm pretty sure. And so when that happens, take note. It's just a few keywords. You don't need to write a whole story about it, but do that over the course of a few years, and it teaches you something about your internal, the flame kind of that gets you energized, and that flame, I think, is very valuable because it can help you make good decisions later within the constraints that you face.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been such an interesting conversation. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences, your expertise. So thank you very much for that.
You're more than welcome, and I wish everyone a wonderful future in either science or any other path they may pursue.